Today I will be reading the lore from the new Raid Hunter armor set, Fight of Trepidation. The lore goes over KORAXIS' past nightmares involving Nezarec. I hope you enjoy the video. The reef's labyrinth of asteroids and debris provided many a hideout for those who wished to be lost, and a potential gathering place for those that partook in less savory acts. A large ketch had set up among the debris, on a large asteroid of its captain's choosing, and had opened for business, supposedly, as a bar. The music bumped, and the clientele, Eliksni pirates, were as rowdy as they were ruthless. KORAXIS sat at a table with his head resting on his upper hands, his cup held in the lower. Exhausted, he hadn't taken a sip since he had sat down, and he hadn't noticed that an imposing captain, flanked by two smaller dregs, had entered the bar. The captain started towards his table. "Where's the relic?" The captain, now towering over the table, chittered in their shared tongue. KORAXIS visibly tensed and gripped his cup so tightly that the cloth woven around his palms strained. "I don't have it," he responded. Before KORAXIS could register what happened, the captain snatched him from his seat. Despite being loosely labeled captain by his crew, KORAXIS was nowhere near the size of the Eliksni before him. His feet dangled in the air. "Pathetic, not worthy of your crew." "You're right," KORAXIS agreed, defeated evident in his tone. The captain's words were venomous, but not as impactful as the fist that had collided KORAXIS' face. The other patrons scattered. A blur of fists and insults erupted. A faint chorus of etherical laughter swellowed beneath the violent chaos. The slow drag of KORAXIS' injured leg made the trek back to his empty ship longer than it had been before. Persistent exhaustion made itself known between each pang of pain that jolted through him. He was thankful the captain's beating had been interrupted by another patron's fist long enough for him to skitter away. But the paranoia of being tracked lingered. It felt as if an unseen force hovered behind him. KORAXIS pushed onward and kept his gaze forward. When he finally made it back to his ship, the airlock hissed opened and revealed a dark space within. He ignored his usual precautions, too focused on the unbearable pain in his limbs. The hammock he'd fashioned for himself called to him. He collapsed into it and didn't exhale until he found a comfortable enough position. Sleep found him as soon as he'd closed his eyes, the fastest he'd achieved in days. Forced insomnia and a surprise beating had taken its toll. Then there was a knock on the door. The moment KORAXIS heard the rap on the metal, he reached for the gun on the shelf beside his hammock. He approached the door with the most delicate footsteps he could manage. A heaviness weighed down on every part of him. He hesitated, eyes fixed on the rusted metal. Rap, tap, tap went the door. The door creaked open, and he immediately aimed down his sights at nothing. Confusion crept into his mind as something hit him hard. KORAXIS scrunched his four eyes shut. He was flung backwards and braced for impact, but it never came. KORAXIS opened his eyes, expecting to see the walls of his ketch. Instead, he saw the lunar pyramid, sleek and dark. KORAXIS instinctively moved towards the pyramid, an echo of a journey he wanted desperately to forget. The pyramid peeked over the edge of the chasm, a foreboding sight. It was complemented by a stillness that filled the area and made him feel as if he were on the edge of suffocating. He remembered how he carefully traversed the jagged paths. It seemed as if the pyramid was pulling him in. Everything felt familiar, including the paranoia, but something was off. The architecture wobbled and shifted with every step that he took. Statues felt as though their heads turned to watch him. Faint whispers danced around the room and faded before they could be comprehended. The air was thick with anxious anticipation, with fear. KORAXIS retread familiar hallways and staircases until suddenly, without realizing, he stepped into an innermost chamber. His chamber. The whispers grew louder as he approached the body, slumped over, enshrouded in shadow at the center of the room. Hisses, yells, and fervent unintelligible phrases all blended as KORAXIS moved closer. The corpse had been picked clean, barely anything left outside of the vague shape of a body underneath the cloak. Be it the threat of curses or sheer fear, his head remained untouched. The whispers grew louder the closer KORAXIS got to the entity's face. His body shook as he stared down at the darkened helmet, a ring of eyes pronounced even in the low light. Despite the same dread that filled him, KORAXIS followed through with the familiar actions and carefully removed one of the eyes. The room shook violently, and before he could safely stow the piece away, KORAXIS toppled over. He closed his eyes and braced for impact. The energy of the crew bustled. KORAXIS opened his eyes, revealing the vastness of space beyond the nearby porthole and a dozen or so Elixini, partaking in various activities. The air was heavy with tension, hushed tones, and cautious movements as they maneuvered around the decks. KORAXIS was quiet, as he had been for the first time, the weight and power of the item he liberated heavy in his palm. It pulsed. The world had changed. Another familiar moment. "Things aren't looking well, Captain," a Dreg whispered to KORAXIS. He remembered this conversation, but did not recognize the Dreg's deep tone. It sounded out of place. The Dreg leaned a bit closer, eyes darting between his shipmates. "Our food is low, the ship needs repairs, and the crew is worried it might be cursed." "Then they can leave," KORAXIS snapped. It was automatic, much like his trek through the pyramid. The Dreg hesitated in surprise. KORAXIS blinked, no longer surrounded by his crew or their voices of discontent. He suddenly found himself in his quarters. It was dark, the type of darkness that felt as if it would devour him. KORAXIS sat at the table by his hammock, just him and the eye. He stared at it, and it stared back. A book of magic lay beside it, a frantic solution to an unexpected problem. The ritual was simple, or so he had thought. He was barely able to translate the text on his own, but was too stubborn, too scared to ask for help. He grasped a pointed crystal in his hand. Words left his mouth, but he couldn't hear them over the incessant whispers. The crystal glowed, and KORAXIS met with an energy blast that propelled him backwards. This time, he felt the impact. The whispers and screams drilled into KORAXIS' mind. He lifted his hands to his face. Whispers and pitiful cheers were the only sounds that escaped him. Again, the sensory around him had shifted, and he had stood on the edge of a meteorite. Though the reef was vast, he recognized the ship's debris following past him, but it was different than he had remembered, twisted in horrifying shapes. The deep purples and blues were dim. It was quiet, save for his own personal audience. KORAXIS held up the eye in his deteriorated hands. It still pulsed with energy. "Free me." He heard the allure, a voice seducing his soul to do its bidding. But the distortion that followed, it reminded KORAXIS why he'd come to this place. An untraceable end for this cursed relic. He balled his fist around the eye. The screams pierced his ears as they grew louder. A dark hand reached out to him. Fingers itched from his arms. KORAXIS flung the eye into the reef with all of the strength he could muster. He collapsed. And then a knock on the door. KORAXIS jolted awake, hand already outstretched to grab his gun. The whispers were gone. His quarters were quiet. He gazed around the room, dazed. KORAXIS stumbled out of bed and delicately approached the door. He aimed down sights. The metal creaked open. Outside was a human, dressed in a dark, ornate cloak, one hand raised in greeting, the other tightly holding a tome. It gave off the same nightmarish energy as the eye, as Nezarec. "Apologies for disturbing your sleep," said the man in the tongue KORAXIS loosely understood. "But would you happen to be KORAXIS?" That's all for this one, and if you want to see more Destiny 2 videos, make sure to like and subscribe.